Welcome in to Inside Carolina's Next Level. I'm one of the hosts, Tommy Ashley. Greg Barnes is the expert here, and we've got a special guest with us again this week, David Hale of ESPN. What's going on, David?
Oh, not a whole heck of a lot, guys. We made it through the regular season. We're all still alive. That's a strong step in the right direction.
It is incredible that we sit here and that college football regular season's over with. I just
It
can't
does feel
believe
like it went faster than any year I can remember, and I don't know if it's just sort of like the fact that like we're I don't know for as much as you might want to say on the other side of COVID, like everybody's back to traveling and being at games and all of that. I don't know. It just felt like it flew by comparatively.
it did. I mean, I'm getting older, so time flies faster, but
Ain't that the truth?
it seems like yesterday we were all up at App State in, I guess, week one after week zero FAMU game. Greg, it's crazy how it goes by. David, I wanted to bring you in. We wanted to bring you in. We've had a couple of national guys on lately, but you, of course, are the resident ACC expert. North Carolina and Clemson in the ACC Championship game Saturday night in Bank of America Stadium. How much does this game mean for a program like North Carolina, at least from your perspective? We know what it means internally, but from the outside looking in, what does this game mean for Mac Brown, the Carolina program? How much of the last 2 weeks changed that, if they have? Just in general, the thoughts on the ACC championship game coming up.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fantastic question to pose about either team right now. I fact checked this the other day. This is the first Power Five conference championship game in which both teams are coming in off of a loss since 2012. Also, the ACC, go ACC. Uh, but I mean, it does sort of beg the question of like, what does this game mean in the big picture of things? Because if you're North Carolina, you had this great season going and lots of energy and enthusiasm, and then you drop two games, one to a team that you really had no business losing to, and one to your chief rival in pretty excruciating fashion. So what's the energy level right now? On the flip side of that, Clemson again also coming off a loss to its chief rival, and a team that was used to going to the playoff every year that for the second straight year it doesn't have any chance at it. And you talk to fans. I mean, I'm on Twitter, and I don't want to ever suggest Twitter is real life because it absolutely is not, or good Lord knows, I hope it's not. But you hear lots of Clemson fans saying, "I'm selling my tickets. I got no interest in going to Charlotte to see this game." Like, I don't know. Is this are both teams sort of licking their wounds, or does it really matter to win an ACC championship in this era of playoff or bust? I think you can easily make the case that for Carolina, this still has an opportunity to be a signature game. A, because beating Clemson still means something for the rest of the ACC, even if Clemson is down a little bit. And B, because Carolina has not won an ACC championship in a long, long time. And Mac Brown even talked earlier this week, like, this is why I came back here, is to put North Carolina back on a national stage. I think there's a lot of sort of national belief that Carolina was a bit overrated even to begin with, and coming on the heels of last year, in which they were most definitely overrated. That's got to be a frustrating place for the team to be in. So I think there's certainly more to prove for Carolina. There's more to play for in a lot of respects. But the flip side of it is Clemson has not been great, particularly on offense this year. But that's still a team with a whole hell of a lot of talent and a whole hell of a lot of pride. So I would be reluctant to suggest they're phoning in a game. I can't remember a time in which I've seen Clemson do that. So I tend to think it's going to be a pretty good matchup of two teams that really care. But it is a unique circumstance for sure.
Yeah, I think with what Dabo has done in Clemson, I mean, I think you make the case that it rivals what Nick Saban has done as Alabama. Maybe not to that extent, of course, but I would be shocked if Clemson doesn't come out prepared. I do find it fascinating. This kind of dates back to last year, as everybody talked about how bad of a year Clemson had last year, and they won 10 games. Um, and when you have guys like Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence who are just elite, best of the best, that really takes that offense to another level. I mean, when you look at the stats for Clemson, yeah, it's not an elite offense, but it's still much better than a lot of the offenses that Carolina has encountered this year, other than maybe Wake. Um, in terms of, DJ gets a ton of heat, and I know he struggled last year. He's been better this year. What have been the major stumbling blocks for Clemson this year? I know it's not just DJ. It seems like their wide receivers have had some consistency issues as well.
Yeah, to me, that's the biggest red flag with Clemson, is because this is a program that quite proudly designated itself as wide receiver U for a long time. And I mean, we're talking about, the era from Nuke Hopkins and Sammy Watkins down to Mike Williams and T. Higgins. And I mean, they're churning out NFL guys on a regular basis. They haven't developed anybody in the last few years. And as much as DJ has struggled, and he has, last year his best wide receiver was a true freshman in Bo Collins. This year, his best wide receiver is a true freshman in Antonio Williams. Like, that's a strange place for a program like Clemson to be in. And Dabo has really shrugged off the transfer portal and said, I'm not going to spend much time on it. They've desperately needed a veteran, consistent receiver for the last 2 years, and they haven't had one. I thought they did a really good job early in the year of working in the tight ends. That has not really been as successful the last probably 4 or 5 weeks. They have not done a great job of utilizing who I think is maybe the most talented player in the ACC, and Will Shipley. He's had more than 20 carries just once this season. If you're Carolina and you have a run defense that is, I think, they're second worst in the ACC, like, the last thing you want is this week everybody asking Dabo why they haven't used Will Shipley more, because if they give him 25 or 30 carries, he might go for 200 yards. But the other thing about Will Shipley is he's a really versatile athlete. I mean, he can catch the ball out of the backfield and be a genuine weapon in the slot, or coming out of the backfield and catching the ball. So I think they've misused him a little bit. The funny thing on the other side of the ball, I think that they're probably their best overall athlete is Trenton Simpson, and they probably misused him a little bit too. And that speaks to sort of the other big issue I think that's been looming over Clemson, is that it's a different coaching staff this year. I mean, they have different coordinators on both sides of the ball, and I don't think either of them have necessarily done a bad job, but you can tell that this has been a team on both sides of the ball that has really struggled to find a core identity of who they are and what they want to do.
David, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but you bring up a point that I wanted to address later anyway. And it's relevant for Clemson, and it's also relevant for North Carolina under Mack. When you have success as a head coach and you have national championship level success, you kind of get set in your ways. And I mean, you go with what works, right? I mean, Roy Williams did that forever. And he was open at the end of his tenure that he didn't want anybody on his staff that he hadn't either coached or had on his teams as an assistant. So I think with Dabo bringing in, Brandon Streeter, kind of elevating him up because they've had, Elliott and Tony Scott have left. You got Wes Goodwin on defense with Venables leaving, all in-house hires. Mack's kind of done a lot of the same things. There's a lot of pressure on some of his guys, Dre Bly, Tommy Thigpen, Tim Cross, who maybe have not coached up to the level that fan base they would like. And the concern is, well, these are Mack's guys. He's going to roll with the guys that he likes. Are we at a point now where Dabo and maybe Mack, although I think it's a little early to make the comment about Mack, are just set in their ways, and they're so interested in kind of keeping going, building within from guys that they know and trust, that it could be a little bit of a detriment?
So, really good question. I think in North Carolina's case, there's always, to me, I think one of the fascinating sort of balancing acts that head coaches have to do in college football is whether you're building out a staff with a focus on recruiting or building out a staff with a focus on development. And ideally, you want guys that do both really well. But I don't know that there's a ton of those guys. Like Dre Bly is a hell of a recruiter. I think there's a question when you look at Storm Duck and Tony Grimes and their development, or lack thereof, like, how good of an on-field coach has he been? I also wonder how much of that can we put on an individual position coach. I tend to think we we point a finger of blame real easily, and I sure as hell am not smart enough to say without question that's where the problem is. But I think there's a little bit when Matt got here, it was like we need a staff that can recruit the hell out of the Carolinas and start improving the talent on this team, which they have unquestionably done. But the obvious follow-up to that is, well, what you've gotten a lot more talent onto the roster now. What have we done with it? And I think there is a good case to be made that the blue chip guys that Mac has brought in have not developed, certainly not developed as quickly as a lot of fans would like. And I think that's a reasonable question to ask why. It's funny that you bring up this question because I have talked to Mac specifically about Dabo before, and Max has, he's pretty blunt about how things ended at Texas and how much of it was, I can remember him talking about how like even winning games wasn't fun anymore because like there was still more criticism coming at you, and that there's all this pressure on you to keep winning because of this whole infrastructure that your success supports, and how much that sucks the fun out of what you're doing. And you start insulating yourself from the criticism because the criticism is everywhere, and that becomes a problem. And I think, I don't think Mac's tenure ended the way he would have liked it to at Texas, but I think he was glad when it was over for exactly those reasons. And you look at Clemson, boy, that looks like exactly what the story is at Clemson right now. Dabo seems angry, miserable, not enjoying things the way that he used to, and he has really closed himself off from the outside world, and both in terms of his hires, but I mean, he just, you just look at how he has handled himself this past week with questions about the quarterback and stuff like that, and he's chippy about it. He's angry. He doesn't want to. I saw on his radio show, the caller called in and asked if he would make coaching changes, and he basically said, if they don't like the way I'm doing things around here, they can find a new coach. That does not give you the sense that this is a guy who is enjoying his situation very much right now, or open to criticism from the outside world. And I get that. Again, you talk about balancing acts in this job, that you have to have an ability to both believe in yourself and your core concepts and what you're doing and the people around you, but also distance yourself from it enough to say like, okay, this isn't working and we do need to do something differently. And I think, to Mac's credit, he did make a change to Gene Chizik at defensive coordinator last year when he knew it needed to happen. How much that has been a success, I think, is still a very open question. I don't know. I don't know if Dabo can, because Dabo's entire sort of persona is built around the fact that he has thumbed his nose at all the people who criticized him over the years, and he proved all of them wrong along the way. So when you see the sun come up every day, you start to assume it's going to keep coming up the next day.
That's a great point about all that. I mean, Mac was not trying to hear any negativity earlier in the week, talking about looking back to NC State, Georgia Tech. He wanted to focus that this North Carolina program is in the ACC Championship game for the second time ever. They're playing for an opportunity to win the ACC for the fourth time in 40 years and all that. So he was all about the task at hand. But I want to stay here just for a minute, David, because it's an interesting point about player development, recruiting, how the transfer portal has changed all that, how NIL, Mac was pretty vocal about that on Monday. So what do coaching staffs need to concentrate on these days in this new landscape? I mean, it's not all about high school recruiting anymore, because you look at Florida State, you made the point on your Twitter feed, Florida State's all their good guys this year were transfers. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
A big number of them, yeah.
So how does that change the landscape for Mac and the coaching staff, and sort of balancing player development versus getting ready-made guys through the portal and all? I mean, it just seems like the game has changed so much. And if you're not having fun doing it, especially if you have made millions of dollars doing it, you think, what's the point? But where do you stand on all of these changes and how it affects a program like North Carolina?
I mean, I think this isn't the answer that I think anybody's supposed to give, but the answer is I don't know. I think we're still really early in this, and I think anybody that tells you that they've got it all figured out is lying, because they don't. We are moving the college game more towards the professional game all the time, and that's a double-edged sword, obviously. But one of the cool things about, following professional sports is there is not one blueprint for how to build a winner. And I think that is true in college too. I mean, what Mike Norvell's doing is really impressive at Florida State. But I think even if you sat Mike Norvell down and asked him, he'd tell you, like, this isn't what I want to do every year. I don't want to have to go out and get a dozen transfers every year in order to put a successful team on the field. It's what he had to do in that situation. There's a blend probably that works. And I mean, like I say, Clemson, Dabo's right. The culture and the people are what has made that program stand out over the years. But that doesn't mean that you prioritize this insular logic over all else when you clearly need a receiver or you clearly need an offensive lineman. I think there's a balance. Some teams are going to need to be more invested, some teams not. I think you're foolish if you think NIL is going to be anything other than pay for play at this point, and you might as well jump all in if you can. I think that the biggest thing is to be sort of open-minded about where things are going, because I don't know that there is an answer. And I feel like there's a lot of coaches right now who are sort of, they're trying to fight the currents. And I don't think that's a winning strategy. I think that will ultimately overwhelm you. I think there is an opportunity for programs that have not traditionally won at the highest levels to say there's a new landscape here and we can embrace it and do something different and have a chance to sort of change the narrative. But again, this is college football has a way of to quote The Wire, the king stays the king, and that's I tend to think that tends to be the way it is in college football. The more things change, until Saban retires, I think largely things will stay the same. But I think the other side of that too is like the teams that can afford to hire more support staff are going to be in a much better position in this day and age too, because at the end of the day, the one thing that can't change is that there's 24 hours in a day, and those coaches cannot do more than what they can do. So the only way to address that when there's more and more put on your plate is to hire more and more people.
You were talking about that. I was thinking of the old riptide thing. You can't fight it. You better swim sideways if you want to try to get in. And but looking at it, I kind of thought when the transfer portal happened, I don't like the immediate transfer, but I thought that sort of leveled the landscape a little bit, because you've got teams, quote unquote lesser teams or G5 teams that are getting talented guys from other schools, and they're able to compete better. I mean, we've seen that across the board, but now I believe NIL has made your point valid. The king is still the king. I mean, how many teams can compete financially with these guys? I mean, we saw a 3-star North Carolina recruit that's got a decommit coming down the road and going to another school down south. Pretty clearly a big NIL deal there. I mean, in your mind, what is the ultimate landing spot for college football? And let's focus it on North Carolina, because Mac said clearly they're not in the ballpark on NIL. Basically a cry for send money, please.
But I think part of it is sort of the willingness to embrace it. As I said, I mean, I like Bubba, and he is a very sharp AD, but I don't think he was stoked about the direction that things were going in, and I don't think he necessarily ran away from it. But I don't think he was the first to jump in the pool either. And so you see this with a lot of programs right now, where they're sort of like, let's wait and see how this plays out. And that wasn't necessarily a bad way of looking at it until you're getting lapped by other people who dove in first and you're playing catch up. And that's a little bit of where a number of good programs are. It's about building out sort of an infrastructure. And again, this all comes down to saying, like, it ain't, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, this is the way it is. And I think this is the answer for college football in general. Like, people want to fight tooth and nail to kind of make things the way that they were before. And I just don't see a way that it's possible, because whether or not you think it is good for the game is, I think, a very valid question. And I have brought this up before, after the Jordan Addison transfer out to USC, which without question, every part of that move made sense for Jordan Addison. He's getting more money, playing with a better quarterback in a higher profile environment with a chance to prove himself for the end. Like, everything made sense for Jordan Addison, and it still sucks. Like, that sucks if you're Pittsburgh and you lost this guy, right? So there is a very good argument about whether this is good for the game of college football. But the fact of the matter is, the there's no collective bargaining agreement. Every other student on campus can transfer without penalty. Every other student on campus can profit off their name, image, and likeness. Every other student on campus has an opportunity to do the same, to do these things, and athletes should have that too by right. Now, does that screw up the competitive balance of college football as a sport? Yeah, of course it does. And I think there's just, but at the end of the day, the tide has turned in terms of public opinion, in terms of the legal opinion. The Supreme Court's ruling last year essentially set the precedent. Like, there's no going back. So the only thing you can do is say, all right, it is what it is. I'm going to get better at this than everybody else is.
Yeah, a staff member told me not too long ago that this was really, at the current moment, it was looking like NFL free agency without contracts.
I mean, and that's the problem, is like, and even like they put in these transfer portal windows, which sounds like a good idea, except no, it doesn't matter. Like it's sort of like when we talk about like when NBA free agency season starts, like everybody's already got their deal in place before it actually starts. So like, and then the day happens, and like the minute that you're allowed to sign contracts, like 50 guys sign contracts. Like obviously people are saying I'm going to go into the transfer portal, or being recruited, are tampering and all of that. That's happening whether there's a window to do it or not. The window just specifies when the formality of it all happens. So I don't know. I think this is, again, I tend to believe that like the if you're going to start professionalizing it, just finish the job and make it to where it's a workable situation. Because the one thing I really dislike in all of this, I dislike the tampering aspect of it. I dislike the fact that athletes on a college campus are being lured away from where they're at with promises that may or may not be deliverable. And I absolutely hate the guys who are quitting in the middle of the season because things aren't going their way and they want to go in the transfer portal. Finish out your season. That should be the bare minimum.
Yeah, I agree. Bud Elliott of Cover 3 podcast on 247 made a great point a couple weeks ago in saying that the transfer portal after this season especially is going to be haywire because nobody could go out and recruit for that 2021 recruiting class because of COVID. And so guys were being signed and they had no understanding of what kind of relationship they would have with their coaches. The coaches didn't know if they had evaluated properly. And so now that we're a year past, everybody kind of understands what the coaches are like, how good the players actually are. And so it really could just be a free-for-all. And hopefully
the impact of COVID, we are really, I think, underappreciating how much that is still driving a lot of what's happening in college football, because exactly what you just said, but then add on the fact that you have all these guys that are taking 6 years of eligibility or 5th years because of the COVID year. I mean, there is just so much in flux right now that, again, I'm hesitant to say like this is how things are going to look 5 years from now, because I think we are in a period of real gray areas right now.
Yeah, and Mac was right that Carolina is going to have a hard time ponying up the cash to compete with the Alabamas and Georgias of the world. But I think the other component too, and this kind of brings us back to Clemson a little bit, since I got us so far off on a dirt road through a jungle. But Mac and Dabo, and there's a lot of other guys like them, one of their strengths as coaches is recruiting at the high school level, and then getting guys in, getting them to stay, and then coaching them up. And now we're talking about the transfer portal and the guys as a 4 or 5 star that's willing to sit on the bench for 3 years. I mean, those guys are fewer and far between. And so I think that really hurts what Dabo wants to do. It certainly is hurting what Mac wants to do. And I think that's some of that frustration. So how those guys counter that, kind of to your point, how they adjust, I think it's going to we'll say a lot about how that style of coaching and program building kind of plays out in the years to come. All right, let's get back on the ACC Championship game, since we don't have you for too much longer, David. We talked a little bit about Clemson's offense. Let's talk a little bit about their defense. Georgia Tech and NC State, and even dating back to Notre Dame and some of the other teams in between, did a really good job against North Carolina's offense and kind of limiting the vertical passing game. We know State secondary is you can make the case is probably the best in the ACC, but State was still able to get pressure on Drake and then he just didn't have time to throw. I think less than 25% of his passes last weekend were beyond the 10-yard mark, which is kind of wild. Clemson, it seems like on the back end, they've suffered some injuries. They have some young guys playing. We know how elite KJ Henry and some of those defensive linemen are. Do you see that the key to this game for North Carolina being a situation of just trying to buy Drake May enough time to take advantage
100%.
down the field?
Yeah. I mean, to me, there's a lot of high quality talent on Carolina's offense, but the weakest position is the O-line, and they have played subpar football the last few weeks without question. And so much of what, Phil Longo's offense is explosive, as we all know, and it's a really good system, but it is a system that is built around timing and accuracy and decision making. And when a defensive front can throw all of that out of whack, you see what the results are. It becomes, it goes from looking like a Ferrari to, you miss one of those spark plugs and all of a sudden it's the Ferrari that's parked on the side of the road waiting for a tow truck. And I think that the absolute critical thing here is to buy some time for Drake May, because as you said, there is an opportunity to beat Clemson down the field. We saw that against Wake Forest, where Sam Hartman absolutely torched their secondary, which admittedly was a little banged up at that time. But I mean, Andrew Makuba just got absolutely destroyed by Spencer Rattler last week. I think there's both an experience deficit at Clemson in their secondary, and I think right now a confidence deficit in their secondary. And Drake May is obviously well poised to take advantage of that. But the flip side of that is Clemson's front seven can be really, really good when they're playing at their best. I think it's a little strange that they have not been better this year, which is not to say they haven't been really good. I mean, they have, without question, been very good, but we're used to sort of the Brent Venables like attacking style, and it hasn't been quite that aggressive. They've lacked sort of that alpha male type of leader, and a lot of people kind of compared this defensive front to the 2018 team that had Christian Wilkins and Cleveland Farrell and Dexter Lawrence and those guys, and it's not been that by a long stretch. So it's sort of like expectations sort of define your judgment. This is still a unit that is more than capable of devouring North Carolina's offensive line if they play a good football game. To me, it's how much can Carolina's offensive line block against that Clemson defensive front. If they can give Drake May some time, there's some huge avenues for Carolina to pick up some big chunk plays. If they can't, I think it's going to look a lot like what that NC State game looked like.
Last question for me, and then we'll let you get out of here. I sort of wanted a two-parter, but one, can you sort of speak to Drake May's performance this year from an ACC perspective, sort of a historical perspective, and also to wrap the show, Carolina wins the ACC Championship game on Saturday night if?
Well, I mean, in terms of Drake, it's, there's just not a lot of guys who have done what he has done at his age. And I mean, particularly you look back last year, Sam Howell's a hell of a quarterback. And so much of what this offense looked like was, just out of sync for way too often. So some of the improvement this year certainly goes to the receivers getting better and the ground game being marginally better, I guess, or at least a little more diverse. But I mean, just comparing Drake with a guy who was an NFL quarterback last year, a veteran NFL quarterback, and he's that much better. Like, to me, that speaks volumes to how good he is. And I mean, certainly, look, I'm a bad scout because I don't know this stuff, right? This isn't my area of expertise. But you talk to the guys in the know, and they will tell you Drake is as talented as any quarterback in college football right now. I mean, he has the tools. I think he clearly has the right sort of perspective and mindset on it too. Like, this is a guy that is going to be scary for the ACC next year and potentially beyond. I would guess that probably just next year. where does he stack up historically? I mean, there's been some damn good ones of late. I mean, Kenny Pickett last year obviously was great. Trevor Lawrence came in and won a national championship as a freshman. I don't know if it's fair to make those sort of comparisons. I think the cool thing about Drake is like, it's funny. I talked to Mac about this when I was doing a story on Drake, and he's like, everybody always wants to ask, like, who does Drake remind you of or whatever? And he's like, look, he's got a little bit of the Vince Young personality. He's got the Colt McCoy accuracy. He's got this Sam Howell competitiveness. And it's like, that's the cool thing about Drake is I don't know that he is one guy that you can compare him to, but he's got a lot of traits of a lot of great players. And to me, boy, that's the best spot you could be in. You've got a guy where you can say, like, he does a lot well, like all of these other guys who used to do one thing or two things well. So anyway, I have high praise for Drake May, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he does get the job done on Saturday against Clemson. I think it comes down to how well the O-line can block, and if they can if they can keep Drake comfortable enough to let him get past his first read, I think that's critical for Carolina's offense. I think defensively, I would be shocked if Clemson is not putting the game in Will Shipley's hands. I think they have got to be able to stop the run or at least slow it down. Force DJ Uiagalelei to beat you. Don't let the ground game beat you. DJ's certainly capable of doing it. We've seen him play really well. Again, you look at the Wake Forest game that gets into a shootout. DJ played really, really well, but he has been struggling in the last month or so. And I think you have to put the game. If you're Carolina, you would rather the game be in his hands and force him to beat you than let Will Shipley run it down your throat. So, a lot of this I think comes down to the line of scrimmage, as it so often does. Can you block for Drake May, and can you slow down the running game for Clemson?
Indeed, all of that stuff is accurate. I agree wholeheartedly. You got to figure out how to stop Will Shipley, a North Carolina kid playing against North Carolina in Charlotte.
In fairness, his parents were NC State grads. So. But I did love Mac's comment earlier this week, though, that he had sweet talked Will's grandma, hoping that was going to get them in. I love Mac. Mac is just the best.
He is. He put out all the stops there, but yeah, better Clemson than NC State for Will Shipley. Carolina will find out how good he is, or if they can contain him on Saturday night. That's been David Hale, a David Hale joint on Twitter. A fun follow. Very interesting discussions. We didn't go the All ACC team route, but if you want to check out David's comments on All ACC teams, check out his Twitter feed.
Don't do it.
Check out his Twitter feed. It's been Inside Carolina's Next Level. I'm Tommy Ashley. That's Greg Barnes. Special thanks to David Hale. Appreciate it, fellas.
Thanks, guys.